Hello, I'm John Thorne from Thorny Motorsport, and this is going to be a short video about springs. Now, we've already done a long video about springs and our replacement spring program for McLaren models. Of course, they break because they corrode. This is slightly different in as much that we've done a lot of spring replacements the last 2 weeks or so, 3 weeks, literally more than I can remember. And some cars we are replacing complete spring sets, front and rear, because they suffered a broken front spring and a broken rear spring. So rather than spend £12,000 replacing the shocks, etc., we are just replacing the springs with our spring replacement program and literally giving the whole car a new lease of life, having all new springs all round, keeping existing dampers, which are nothing wrong with them. Now, all of our springs have been like for like, made exactly for the original equipment, so there's no change in terms of ride or handling, just with different coatings to avoid some of the corrosion issues that we have. But there are a couple of models that we haven't done a spring for, because simply there's not that many of them, and also the tooling costs of making springs is not cheap. And one of those models is the 570 GT, which is the coupe back version of the 570S. You call it a coupe back, but now, that's a reasonably rare car in the UK, but we had a couple of cars come in with broken springs. They suffer the same issue, and one of them had broken front and broken rear. Now, the owner, we said, look, we don't have a 570 GT spring yet. We don't think we will do one because it's obviously a reasonably small model, but we do have the 570S spring, which will fit straight on that car. They're we're going to show you in a second, identical in terms of size. Worth a go. Now, the owner was quite keen to have an improvement in handling, and there was some concerns when they brought the 570 GT out that they softened the handling down. The springs on the 570 GT, depending who you read, and we haven't actually tested these yet. We are going to send these away to be tested to confirm. But in theory, the information that we've managed to ascertain is that the front and the rear springs are softer on the GT compared to the 570S, which would give a softer ride, which makes sense. McLaren are making this thing as a GT Aston Martin type competitor. So with the stiffer spring, we're going to get back to the 570S handling from the 570 GT coupe body, and so we gave it a go. Now, for example, I've got two springs here, front and rear. So this is a spring. This is a front spring from a 570S. Okay. Now, so you can see that's one, and now this is a spring from a 570 GT. Now, as you can see, whilst they're the same size, they are different in terms of the spring rate. Now, I'm not intending this video to be a spring video and about details of it, because frankly, it's a fascinating subject. I could go all day about it. But what I'm going to show you is two different springs. So this is a rear spring from a 570S. And as you can see, it's a linear rate spring. That means that basically the distance, the pitch of the coils of spring are the same all the way through. So it basically means that spring, when you compress it, will give a linear compression rate, so it won't change. Okay, so that's a rear spring from a 570, and if you compare it to a rear spring of a 570 GT, it's the same, but it is a different gauge wire. So it is obviously the 570 is slightly softer, about 10%. Now, if you look at a front spring, this is known as a progressive rate spring. Now, again, I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail because the whole video is about springs, but as you can see, the two 570s, the GTs, little label means GT, and that's S, are different. So what you've got is a different level of progressive rate springs on these shocks, on these cars. Now, how progressive rate springs work, and there's a lot of videos out there that are quite wrong on this subject, is that what happens is that a spring is a spring, okay? When you compress it, it doesn't know which bit's being compressed at any given time, okay? So the difference of pitch of the wider pitch here to the narrower pitch here means that the wider pitch, technically speaking, is harder to compress, okay? And a simple thing, if you look at the angle of the spring, the bigger the angle, the harder compression required. The narrow one here, for example, is much easier to compress because it's a narrow angle, okay? So I can actually physically pull those springs in with my hands. The bigger one, I can't move it. Okay, so bottom line is that this is a softer compression rate. This is a stiffer compression rate. But when you compress a spring, it doesn't know. When you compress it, it's just a spring. It's not that clever. So what happens is when you actually compress a spring, the whole spring will compress, but this will compress first. Once this is completely compressed, as in completely together, then this spring rate takes over. So what you have is a single spring rate until this bottom part is compressed, then a separate spring rate for when obviously that has compressed. Now, a lot of this softer spring rate will be taken up by the weight of the car. It can sit in the cup, and often the weight of the car will basically take some of that spring rate up. But what you see at different springs in a GT is at different levels. So what you've got is the weight of the car is making less of an issue in terms of the height of in terms of the spring compression, but there's a softer period for the GT. Now, that's for the S, sorry. Now, the issue that you have is that that's a different spring rate in terms of how the car will handle. Now, we've swapped them both over, and what we tend to have found is that, essentially speaking, you are getting a lot better handling from the 570S spring in terms of just the sharpness of turning, sharpness of steering. It's a harder ride, obviously, because it's different spring rates. So the ride is a little bit harder, as you'd expect from the S. As the S, as GT, etc., is more of a comfortable type car. Now, I've always really rated the 570 GT handling, because that softer spring rate gives a better grip, because obviously your softer ride means more movement of the wheel, therefore you're going to get more grip for it. Whereas 570S can be a bit squirrely on the back, because obviously it suffers from less spring movement, so compared to GT. But taking a GT and putting 570S springs on has actually given us the outcome of a much sharper handling 570 GT. Ride is a bit stiffer, as you'd expect from different springs, but it's not significantly so. So what you end up is a car, the 570 GT, with arguably more attractive looks in terms of the back, which is a smoother lookout compared to the S. The extra luggage space you get from the GT, but all the handling attributes of the 570S. So we thought it was worthwhile sharing. We are going to send these springs away to be tested just to confirm, but the theory is that one is 15% stiffer, one is 11% stiffer on the 570S, which would make sense compared to kind of car. But also to reflect the fact, if you do get a broken spring, you do not need to replace the entire shock. You can just put one of our replacement springs on. But it's quite fun. The handling of the car is really good. It's worthwhile an upgrade in terms on its own right. To replace all the springs on a car is around about £1,200. Compared to changing all 4 shocks, you're looking at more like £10,000. So it's quite a big difference. So it's worth an upgrade. So if you've got a 570 GT and you've got a broken spring or several broken springs, maybe looking at the idea of changing handling a car, a bit more aggressive handling, but keeping all the GT attributes that you've purchased. All right. Hope that's useful. Talk to you soon. Cheers.